Hello and welcome to Sunday Chat. This is the second issue of my audio recordings of scripture reflections, basically, and the date that I'm working with right now is August the 12th, and you will find the written reflections in my Sunday Bible talk as well. So, starting point: a hearth cake, an angel's touch, and also a jug of water. These are three images of you might say, possibility, potential, and grace that we find in the story of Elijah in our first reading. Elijah is in a situation of despair. He's given up on life. He's perhaps given up on God. He's there lying down in a state of despair, asking God basically to take his life. He's reached the lowest point possible. So here is the paradox of a holy man of God who actually is giving up on life. The backstory. Just shortly before, Elijah had put to death 450 of the god Baal's prophets, and it's sort of a gory image. He actually slits their throats, which enrages the queen Jezebel. And so she is now determined to put him to death as well. But before the killing of the prophets, there's a very significant action, and that is that Elijah challenges the prophets, the false prophets of Baal, that is, to a test. And he invites them to build an altar and to ask their God to come down and consume their offering, their sacrificial offering of an animal, and consume it with fire. And that if their God can do that, then obviously their God has credibility. He in turn also builds an altar, and if his God comes down with fire to consume the animal sacrifice, then that means that his God, the God of Israel, is the God who holds the power. And so the prophets of Baal agree to this, and they build their altar, they put the pieces of meat on the altar, and they pray to Baal to come down and consume the meat. And they dance and they sing and they slash themselves with knives, and apparently they do this from at least morning till noon. There's even a reference in scripture to them hopping around, which I think is a little funny. So there are the prophets hopping around trying to bring down Baal's fire upon their offering. Nothing happens. Meanwhile, Elijah douses his offering with water. Not only that, but he builds a trench around his altar and fills that with water. And then he calls down the name of God. And down comes the divine fire, and not only consumes the animal sacrifice, but also consumes all the water. And so basically Elijah has proved that the prophets of Baal are false, and that God is the victor in this. So we've had this immense display of divine power, and even so, Elijah is running for his life, and he goes to this tree and lies down and asks God to take his life. And so we might want to think about our own lives when we have seen moments of divine power, and yet we fall into discouragement and despair just as Elijah does. Fortunately, the angel touch comes to him, awakens him, asks him to eat, which he does, but then having eaten, he goes back to sleep again. He's still in the old consciousness of despair, and although he went along with the requirement of eating, he did not get himself up and start moving. But then the angel touch comes again and points out again the hearth cake, the jug of water, and tells him to eat for the journey. For the journey is going to take 40 days and 40 nights. And of course that number is significant too. We have 40 days and 40 nights in so many Bible stories, whether it's Noah's Ark, whether it's the story of the Israelites wandering in the desert, whether it's Jesus in the desert at the beginning of his ministry. So 40 days and 40 nights always has to do with a new consciousness. And so Elijah has to leave behind the old consciousness of disbelief and despair and then move towards the mountain of God, Mount Horeb, where he will find a new consciousness and new faith, and he will be able to encounter God. So basically it's a journey of faith again, that Elijah, to be the prophet of God, has to have his faith restored. And that's where the angel's touch, the jug of water, and the little hearth cake are so important. Well, if Elijah, the holy man of God, can be discouraged, what about us? I think we live in an age of acute discouragement, whether we're discouraged about the state of the country we live in, those of us who live in the United States, or even if we live in Europe and elsewhere, the state of the world is enough to make anyone discouraged. So many stories of human misery and suffering, particularly in terms of migrant populations. So many stories of racism and hatred and ethnic cleansing. We really live in a world that is sad. At the same time, we also live in a church that has its problems, a society that has its problems, whether to do with gun violence or police brutality. And of course, I could go on and on. And then, of course, there are our personal issues that each of us faces, whether it has to do with relationships or finances or employment. But there are always issues that we have to face that can plunge us into a state of despair and make us give up on ourselves and give up on God. And then we ourselves go to look for a little broom tree and fall asleep. And if there is a jug of water, a hearth cake and an angel's touch, we don't even notice. All we have to do is look at the big epidemic right now of celebrity deaths. Young people mostly, musicians, artists, actors, even athletes, who take their lives, and we have to ask ourselves why. Perhaps fame is not enough, perhaps material possessions have not been enough, perhaps they are hungering and thirsting for that jug of water, that little hearth cake, and that angel's touch, which could have helped them through the 40 days and 40 nights of the journey from a state of lack of consciousness into consciousness of God's presence. Jesus is the bread of life. He declares himself as such. And as bread of life, he is not simply asking us to imitate him. No, that would not be enough. Nor is he simply asking us to serve him. And again, that would be limited. Rather, he is inviting each of us into the intimacy of divine friendship, into intimacy with him in which he is the ground of our being. He is our Alpha and Omega. He is the source of our strength. He is the hearth cake. He is the jug of water. He is the angel's touch. And if we can turn to him for this divine intimacy, if we can really respond to his invitation, then even when the going gets tough, even on the darkest days, even when we're willing to go under that broom tree and say, God, I've had enough, then we will have food for the journey, food to take us from the place of lack of consciousness into the place of consciousness of God's presence. And that, my friends, is what will save us from going over the edge. And so it is then that Jesus, the bread of life, is what keeps us sane and keeps us holy and also keeps us grounded and able to reach out to others who may have lost their way. And this is the end of Bible Chat for today, and I look forward to being with you next Sunday.